Do you have some sort of touchstone in your life that you turn to guide you when you're uncertain? Maybe a phrase or an image or an idea that you always go back to. It's your touchstone. I have one that came from a bumper sticker years ago. It said, "Life is a school. Love is the lesson." I turn to that all the time. Like when something is hard, as things often are, when I'm in the middle of something and I think, why is this so hard? It's like, well, because life is a school. You're in school. So sure, learning is hard. It's all new. And then when I'm like, well, what am I supposed to do with this? What's the outcome that's supposed to come? Life is a school and love is the lesson. So always go in the direction of love. Sometimes that's a difficult route to find, but if we're going in the direction of love, then it's going to work out. That's my touchstone, but everybody has their own. One woman recently told me hers is the line in the New Testament that says, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." You may have one too, a scripture or a phrase that you go to that holds it all together for you. A lot of you know that on Sunday nights, we watch The Chosen with our parish's teenagers, and we do it to get a closer look and a better understanding of the life of Jesus. And we get to see in the first season a moment where we know what Jesus' touchstone is. He's hanging out with some kids, and they said, "Why do you like hanging out with kids?" And he said, "Because you know what's really important. Sometimes adults forget that, but you never do." And then he said to them, "What is really important?" And the kids, from memory, in unison, said, "Hear, O Israel, you shall love the Lord your God with all your mind and all your heart and all your soul and all your strength." The exact thing we just heard today. And Jesus teared up. And he said, "That's so good, children. That's exactly right." We now could see what his touchstone was. And he did it better than anyone else. We have that touchstone moment every time we have a baptism with a family bringing a new child into the parish. You've been here perhaps for some baptisms at Mass where you've seen what happens. They bring the child in and we do this ritual naming ceremony that goes all the way back to the great temple in Jerusalem. In the tradition, it was always that the parents would bring the child on the 8th day of life. And they would not say the name of the child publicly until they said it before God in the temple. And so that's what we do. I say, "What name do you give your child?" And they proclaim it publicly. And then I say, "And what are you asking of God's church for this child?" And they say, "Baptism." And then I say, "That means you're going to teach your child to love God with all of their mind and heart and soul and strength, and that they'll love their neighbor as themselves." Do you understand that that's what this means? And the parents say, "We do." It's the touchstone of why we're parenting in this way, why we're doing this. The thing that's tricky about living out this commandment to love the Lord your God with your everything is that a lot of people interpret it as putting God first in their life. And I don't think we could argue with that. I mean, of course, God should be number one. But there's some people who I see not going as far in their spiritual life as they could because they're hung up on that. And I think you may be familiar with this kind of thinking. A lot of good people think this way, and you might be one of them. They say, "I can't put my kids number two. Don't ask me to rank my kids number two. I just don't think I can do it. My instincts won't let me do it. Don't tell me to put my marriage at number 4. It just doesn't sound very nice. I don't like the sound of that. Don't make me rank things like that." And what I love is, I think we're hearing in this commandment, it never says that. That's the way we took it, but it doesn't say that. And I wonder this, what if this commandment is not saying God needs to be number one? What if God isn't saying, I want to be number one? What if God is saying, I want to be in the center of everything? I'm not asking to be your first priority. I'm asking to be a part of every priority, right in the center. So for those of us who say, well, what about my parenthood? Where are my kids supposed to be? God's going to be right in the center of them, right in the center of that. What about my marriage? Right in the center. A lot of people, if we were ranking, would say, well, I'll make God number one after travel soccer season is done. Then I'll be able to put God back in number one. Or after tax season is done, if you have a certain career, then I can make God number one again. And it's like, no, put God in the middle of tax season, in the middle of your child's senior year, in the middle of your struggle with anxiety, in the middle of travel soccer season. Many of you know that I am thinking every day about my friend Father Jim, my childhood hero, a priest back home who is dealing with tongue and mouth cancer right now. And the last time I visited him, he talked about the scripture we're talking about today. He brought it up. He said, you know that scripture where it says you should love the Lord your God with all your mind and your heart and your strength? He said, you know, that scripture means something so different to me now with cancer. He said, I've been a priest now for 50 years. And he said, I think I always loved God with my heart. That's what drew me in. And he said, I spent a lot of time writing homilies and reading scriptures and talking. I think I've often been good about loving God with my mind. But he said, but it's now that I'm dealing with cancer, I'm loving God with my strength. Because he said, sometimes my heart is hurt that I have to go through this. And my thoughts are all cloudy and overwhelmed, and I'm questioning all the time. He said, so the way that I can love God now is with my strength. So this is where I think it's interesting for us to then see what Jesus did with this touchstone. Jesus says, yep, you should love the Lord your God with all your mind and heart and soul and strength, and then he expands it. And love your neighbor as yourself. He took the love that we're funneling toward God and said, now expand it. Allow yourself to love your neighbors too. And I think that's where we see this book come in this week, since all of us are focusing on forgiveness. Many of you are reading Everybody Needs to Forgive Somebody. And I think forgiveness is the version of living this commandment with our strength. It's easy to love our loved ones with our heart and our mind when things are going well, but when they hurt us, we're going to have to love them with our strength. If all things were equal, once someone hurt us, we would just be like, I'm done with you, get out of my face. Or we would get revenge. But because Jesus says, no, I want you to love them. I want you to pray for people who are rude to you. I want you to love your enemies. We say, because if we are loving God with our mind and heart and soul and strength, then when God says, here's what I want you to do, we can't ignore it. We can't say, that's nice, God, but I've got other priorities. Well, if we're loving God and listening to God, then we can't ignore something that clear. So then we say, how am I going to forgive this person? I can't even think about this person without my blood turning to acid. How am I going to do this? And that's what we're looking at over these next weeks. But the starting point might be to say, we're not going to be able to forgive from a place of weakness. We're going to have to be in a place of strength. It's what it means to love our neighbor with strength. Because it's not going to make sense to our minds, and our hearts might not feel like it. But we're called not just to love God with those things, but with our strength, and maybe our neighbor as well. So this week, where are you in this? Where's the pinch point for you? Where is it difficult for you? How are you at loving God with your mind, with your heart, with your strength? Which of those things is the easiest and most natural for you? And which of them, like Father Jim, had you maybe never done before that you're thinking about? How about with your neighbors? When we bring up the topic of forgiveness, when I told you the name of the book was Everybody Needs to Forgive Somebody, who came to your mind? Your ex? Someone from work? Someone in your family? All of us have someone to forgive. What would it look like to begin to think of loving our neighbor with our strength being a kind of lens to understand forgiveness? The beautiful thing about a touchstone is that you can go there when nothing else seems to make sense to you and get grounded. And we know that there was one who lived loving God and loving neighbor better than anyone else. And he's right in front of us all the time. For him, loving God and loving us was one piece of cloth. There was no seam. It was all part of the same thing. And he showed us that in the biggest way on Good Friday. Perhaps the crucifix before us is the only touchstone we will ever need.